Until the pandemic came and hit us, I think a lot of people were not quite so aware as to how much our lives are impacted by global events that might start anywhere.
This is a real crisis.
I mean, it's been clear that this was likely to spread in the U.S.
We need to be thinking much more ambitiously.
Climate finance is a very big issue.
We, the Center for Global Development, we're a group that try and see how we can make the international system that supports global development work more effectively.
CGD came about because it was time to focus not only on what developing countries should do, but much more on what the rich world should do.
How do we finance infrastructure in the poorest parts of the world? How do we increase productivity in agriculture? What kind of policy brings out the best outcomes?
Some of our previous work has helped to come up with a kind of innovative financing mechanism that was used to help launch pneumococcal vaccines. We really have researchers and experts here at CGD who come at these issues from multiple vantage points, and I think that's just what helps make our research more rigorous, more rich, and actually more connected to the realities that decision makers are grappling with.
We've been looking to CGD for all of your research and analysis to guide us.
So CGD is nonpartisan. Because of that, over the years, that credibility has given us significant convening power.
Our government highly values the work.
What CGD is about is you can ask those difficult questions that people refuse to ask and actually find solutions.
We're thinking about how climate change will impact migration patterns, how that will in turn have impacts on people's health.
It's challenging to be able to align budget with ambitious programmatic goals, but it can be done.
Every single time that we're able to get it right, it means we're reducing significant poverty.
If you can help to make things a little bit better, that's a good way to spend your time.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this event. I'm really happy to see all of you here. I'm Michael Clemens of the Center for Global Development, also a fellow at IZA Bonn and the Center for Research and Analysis of Migration at UCL. And I'm just delighted to be hosting this seminar on the effects of visa restrictions on migrants' legal status and well-being. And the seminar is going to be by Omar Hammoud-Gallego, who is a data scientist and fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science in the School of Public Policy. He's studied migration policies, refugee policies, and challenges to democratic legitimacy around the world, three interconnected subjects. He got his PhD from the LSE last year. Someone sent part of it to me, and it struck me as so innovative and so policy relevant that I asked him to come here and tell all of us about what he learned. And I'm delighted that he agreed. What I did next was talk with my colleague Helen Dempster, saying we need a discussant for this seminar. And my best case scenario would be Mathias Czaika, but we probably won't get him. But try him first, and then we'll find another one. And to my delight, Mathias said yes. Mathias Czaika is a university professor in migration and globalization at Danube University Krems in Austria, as well as the head of his department. That alone would make him a fantastic discussion for this presentation, but it also so happens that there's no expert in the world more recognized than Mathias on exactly the field where Omar is making this contribution. So we've just got very highly innovative new work discussed by the top expert in the field, and this is going to be a great hour. We're going to wrap up a little less than an hour from now. First, we're going to go straight to Omar Hammoud-Gallego for his presentation of roughly 15 minutes of the highlights of his research, discussed thereafter for 10 or 15 more minutes by Mathias Czaika, and then we will open it up to your questions, your discussion. The best way to submit a thought or a question for either Omar or Mathias is in the comments on the YouTube page, just the standard comment function. Put your questions there. We will get them immediately, and we will discuss them. So if I can ask Omar to come on. Thank you so much, Omar.
Oh, thanks for the invitation, Michael. Shall I start by sharing my screen? Are you able to see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, that's perfect. All right, everyone. First of all, thanks so much to Michael for the invitation, and for Mathias, of course, to accept to being the discussant. This is a great honor, really. As Michael mentioned earlier, this is the last part of my doctoral research that is finding its way to publication. But I've been able to engage with many policymakers, especially on these findings, and I think they find them quite promising, and hopefully you'll find them thought-provoking, especially because the direction of policy is basically opposite to what this evidence suggests. Now, so I'll present this research article. This is now a research article with this title, "The Short-Term Effects of Visa Restrictions on Migrants' Legal Status and Well-Being." And what I do is that I focus on the case of the Venezuelan displacement crisis. Now, the audience of this think tank is surely familiar with it, but for those who are not, a short motivation, really. For those of you, again, who are not familiar with it, Venezuela has been suffering a deep crisis. Its GDP has shrunk considerably since 2013. Hyperinflation eroded the value of the currency and has led to a de facto dollarization of the economy. And this all has led one that was, actually the wealthiest country in South America to having a population of around 90% at the moment now in poverty. And of course, all of this has led to many people deciding to leave the country, as this picture below shows. This picture is actually quite important because it shows how this is the river Táchira, which is one of the many crossing points that Venezuelans use to cross from Venezuela into Colombia. And it's an extremely, for those of you who are not familiar with the geography of South America, it's an extremely long border of more than 2,000 kilometers long. And as you can see in this part is so shallow that migrants, there's actually a whole economy functioning around these border areas that are mostly controlled by armed groups. Now, this whole crisis led to around 6 million people deciding to leave the country. And whilst a few fortunates, especially those with passports and double nationalities, have been able to go to the US or even Europe, the overwhelming majority, around 5 million, have only been able to move within Latin America and effectively, more specifically, to South America. And while there is a small number that has moved from Venezuela into Brazil, the overwhelming majority has done the journey from Venezuela into Colombia. And then, if they had the resources, they've made their way downwards towards Ecuador and Peru to end up in places such as Chile, Argentina, or even Uruguay. Now, let me state clearly what is the research question of this article. There are two research questions. The first one is, does the introduction of visa restrictions actually reduce the inflow of migrants within a context such as the South American one, which is one of mass displacement? Which means that many people are leaving the country because of some shock. In the case, the shock is the economic, social, and political collapse of Venezuela. And also, does it work in a context of porous borders, which means borders that are very wide and are very difficult to patrol? And on top of answering this first question, I also want to know, how does the introduction of these restrictions in turn affect migrants' well-being? And what I will do is that I will focus on 4 outcome variables. The first is the likelihood of migrants entering the host country irregularly. The second is the likelihood of migrants lacking a regular visa or a permit to stay in the country. Now, these two variables are very similar, but they're actually measuring something different, although very often they correlate. Because in the first case, you can enter a country irregularly, which means not through the regular crossing points, but then you can apply for asylum, for instance, and therefore you have a regular permit to stay in the country, or the other way around, you can enter regularly as a tourist, which is what happened with many Venezuelans, especially at the beginning, and then overstay your visa and therefore fall into irregularity. And then I'll focus on other 2 outcome variables of interest. The first is the likelihood of migrants having suffered some form of violence on their way there. And finally, the priority of migrants. As you will see in a second, we have data on the priorities of migrants, and I'm especially concerned to when migrants say that their first priority is getting hold of legal documents, which is often something that happens when they find themselves in an irregular situation. As the title mentions, this research uses a difference in differences design, which very simply means that we compare some countries that were treated in the language of social sciences, which means in this case they introduced visa restrictions, and the countries that were not treated, which means that they did not change their policies. In this case, we'll compare the cases of Chile, Ecuador, and Peru that introduced visa restrictions in 2019 with those of Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Uruguay who did not. The case of Colombia is a bit special, and I'll go into more detail in a second. Now, as you can see in this chart here, we have more or less an idea. I want to show this just to give you an idea of the sheer scale of this migration, because Latin America is very much a region that has been often, and it still very much is in a certain way associated with emigration, especially towards the US and or Europe. But in this specific case, you will see that because the Venezuelan migration crisis has been so big that effectively the countries that were not used to migration have received unbelievably big numbers, especially in situations in which there is barely a functioning welfare state or a state that can accept this many migrants and refugees. So if you look at the numbers for Colombia, the estimate is that there are around 2.5 million Venezuelans in the country, followed by Peru with 1.3 million. Chile and Ecuador host roughly 500,000 each, and then much lower numbers for the other countries. And as you see, also many of them have not been recognized as refugees, although this is a different research question, but I just want to flag out that according to the legislation of many countries, they could actually be recognized as refugees. But then this is beyond the scope of this research. Now, what are the facts? The facts are very simple. So at the beginning of 2019, if you were a Venezuelan, you could cross borders in South America, in most countries across South America, only with your ID card. This is a legacy of the Mercosur integration process and many other integration processes that took place in the early 2000s in the region. But then what happened? Because so many Venezuelans were using their ID cards and moving into countries across South America, because of a backlash by the host populations, in 2019, Chile and Peru in the month of June, and Ecuador a few months later in August decided to introduce restrictions to stop the inflow of Venezuelans. These restrictions basically meant that Venezuelans were required to have a passport in many cases and to apply for a visa in order to be able to migrate into these countries. And of course, this might sound like a little requirement, but any Venezuelan will be able to tell you that getting hold of a passport in the country can cost up to thousands of dollars, and that is therefore inaccessible to the vast majority of the population. And so I compared these three cases with the cases of Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, who did not introduce any restrictions, so you could still cross into these countries only with your ID card. And the case of Colombia, which is a bit different because Colombia already required a passport even before 2016. So again, Colombia is really an imperfect case, and I take this into consideration in the research strategy. Now, the main issue, of course, when you try to study irregular migration, how do you study it? And luckily, the UNHCR and partnering agency have started actually collecting data on migrants, and this data has been made available through the microdata initiative of the UNHCR, which I highly encourage other researchers to exploit. And from this data, I was able to retrieve information for about roughly 80,000 Venezuelan migrants, which was collected between January 2019 and March 2020. And this data actually has a lot of information about their legal status, how they entered the countries, their education, their age, if they've suffered some violence in the way to the host country, which ones are their first three priorities now that they're in the host country, in which month they were interviewed, and roughly when they entered these countries. As I said, all of these of the people in this data set are Venezuelans, and as you can see, roughly 20,000 were interviewed in Peru and Ecuador, roughly 15,000 in Colombia, a bit less in Chile, and then much less so in other countries. I also have data for the Dominican Republic, but we don't use it because the Dominican Republic, being an island, follows very different migration dynamics. Now, how was this data collected, right? Because it's very difficult to collect data on irregular migrants, as it's obvious to anyone who's tried. And so what happened is that the UNHCR and partnering agencies basically set up in migration centers and on the close to border areas. They started surveying migrants who would approach them and ask for some advice or some support. And so in these areas, these agencies and these organizations would use a standardized software developed by the UNHCR to collect data from these migrants and refugees. Now, all the bars that you see here show the different rounds of interviews and how many people were interviewed in each month. And here there is already a first issue with this data, which is unfortunately the best we can get, which is the fact that the data was not really collected systematically, but still, I think it can give us a pretty good idea of who were these individuals and what happened to them after the introduction of these restrictions. As you can see, we have more frequent survey rounds in Chile, in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, and much less so, fortunately, in the other countries. And the dotted straight line that you see in the middle of the charts basically is the month in which restrictions were introduced. So we have a fair amount of survey rounds both before and after, which allow us to make some inference about what happened after the introduction of these restrictions. Now, I think it's worth, for brevity's sake, jump straight into the results. What does this data show? I think the results are quite straightforward. Using a standard linear model, basically we find that introducing visa restrictions increased irregular entry by 38 percentage points in those countries that introduced restrictions compared to those that didn't. If we repeat the same analysis with irregular visa as a dependent variable, we find that, again, also irregular visa increased by 41 percentage points compared to those countries that, in the treated countries, compared to those that did not introduce restrictions. And so just to give you an idea, for instance, in the first case for the regular entry, in those countries that introduced restrictions before that, roughly 14% of individuals would enter those countries irregularly. And after the introduction of restrictions, that increased to roughly 43%. Then if we look at the last model, which is about the likelihood of having suffered some form of violence, we see that there is no effect. So basically, and this is quite counterintuitive, but it seems that effectively introducing these restrictions did not lead to more violence suffered by migrants against what might be natural intuition and a lot of anecdotal evidence. But I'll contextualize these findings in a second. And then another series of models where I look at priorities. And so what I do here is that I basically codify as one if the migrant says that getting hold of legal documents is their first priority, or second or third, and zero otherwise. And what we find is that effectively introducing these restrictions leads to an increase in legal documents as a first, second, and even third priority. And I will discuss at the very end. I'll show why this is relevant. Now, some might say, okay, fair enough, this is one-off. I want to see, how did this affect over time the trends in migration? And so what I do is that I repeat this analysis, but at the monthly level. And what we find is that, for instance, in the case of irregular entry, while there were a few people that entered irregularly before the introduction of restrictions, and I'm happy to discuss why in the Q&A session, we see that the coefficient jumps and stays quite stable between 40 and 60% in the 9 months following the introduction of restrictions. So this suggests really that this has been quite robust as an effect, right? Has taken place over time and has stayed on for the 9 months after the introduction of restrictions. And if we do the same analysis for the likelihood that migrants will lack a regular visa, we find that effectively the magnitude of the coefficients is very similar. So again, a few people did not have a visa beforehand, before the introduction of these restrictions, and many more do lack one after the introduction of these restrictions. So this suggests that effectively the results are quite robust. But then we want also to look at violence suffered, right? Because of course many people are not convinced. Why is it that introducing these restrictions did not lead to more violence suffered? And I think these results are quite clear. So in this plot, you see that whilst there were no effects on, or clear effects at least, on introducing these, or how these restrictions actually led to more violence being suffered, it does not mean that migrants did not suffer violence. What this suggests is that migrants suffered violence both before the introduction of these restrictions and after. And why this is the case, I have a few hypotheses, and I'm happy to discuss this later. But I think there is quite a good ground to believe that these results are robust, having studied well the data. And then finally, I repeat the same analysis, looking at legal documents. As you see here, also there is a jump, although the effects are much less clear than I wish they were. But I think this is something we have to accept. Now, of course, the research article is very long, and I do different robustness checks, but I want to show one last one, which is a regression discontinuity analysis that I conduct. I won't show the model, but I will show the pre and post treatment trends. And what we see here is, I believe, quite clear. You see, for instance, in the panel above on the left-hand side, that the introduction of these restrictions led to a clear decrease in people entering regularly in those countries that were, so to speak, treated, which means, in this case, that introduced visa restrictions. If you look at the panel on the right-hand side, above in the right-hand side, you would see, for instance, that the percentage of migrants who lack a residence permit increased in the post-treatment period, only in those countries that introduced the restrictions, whereas the findings for migrants who suffered violence and legal documents in the two panels below are a bit less muddy and therefore not so clear, unfortunately. Right. So as I promised, I hope I've been brief enough. So here the conclusion, and then I'm happy to discuss any detail later on. The first conclusion is the following: that introducing these restrictions led to an increase in irregular entries by roughly 38 percentage points and irregular visa status by 41 percentage points. These restrictions do not seem to have had a significant effect on the levels of violence reported by migrants, even controlling for instance, the country in which the violence took place. I haven't disaggregated by type of violence. I don't know if there is a certain type of violence that we're more likely to expect that would happen in border areas. But again, I'm happy to, if anyone has any idea, I'm really happy to discuss this. Third, although this is not something that I have not discussed now, but it's discussed in the research article, what I find is that basically the first priority for migrants before the introduction of these restrictions in the treated countries, right, in the countries that did eventually introduce these restrictions, their first priority before the introduction was to look for a job, right? So as soon as they got into the country, they were interviewed and said, my first priority is to get some form of employment. And then what happened later, after introduction of these restrictions, is that they said, no, actually seeking a job now is my second or third or even outside of this range priority, whereas my first priority is to get some sort of legal documents because I need to be able to, get a contract of some sort, be able to send my kids to, feel safe to send my kids to school, approach a hospital if I need, talk to the police if I need, instead of being harassed, etc., etc. However, as I've said very briefly, these results are not extremely robust. So again, the evidence, at least for this last variable, the one in priorities, is mixed. Second to last point is that, and again, this is something that the data show, and I have a table to prove it, is that the composition of respondents did not change before and after the introduction of restrictions. So basically, the UNHCR and these agencies studied the same population before and after introduction of restrictions, following the same, if you want, survey strategy, collecting data in the same places. And so because the composition of respondents didn't change and also the numbers didn't change substantially, what it does suggest effectively is that these restrictions just led to a substantial did not lead to a substantial decrease in entries, but rather just changed the way migrants decided to enter these countries. And so finally, if there is any policy relevance to all this, which I believe there is that introducing restrictions under these circumstances is harmful, both for migrants and their host societies. And this is something that some countries have realized eventually. And so effectively what Colombia started doing in March 2021 was to regularize and give a 10-year blanket visa permit to all Venezuelan migrants. And I was very happy to hear that Ecuador started something similar a couple of weeks ago. And so if there is any message for any policymaker here from Ecuador, from Peru and Chile, in this specific case, is that they should definitely try and emulate these two cases. I look forward to your questions, and feel free to get in touch. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Omar. Perfectly on time, and we really appreciate it. Without wasting any time, let us go directly to Mathias. Thank you so much for being here, Mathias.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much, Omar, for really giving me the opportunity to comment on your excellent paper, which I very much enjoyed reading and thinking about. Reading the paper was very refreshing, really, for me, and basically for two reasons. Because there's obviously need for more research of this kind, so assessing migration policies with regard to their effects and impacts on migration flows. But there's a lot of research that is out there has a European or North American focus and a bias in that regard. So it's really refreshing to see some research going on here in another part of the world. And it was refreshing because I think it's been the first time I've seen this kind of research using micro level data. So really assessing policy effects at the micro level and not at aggregate macro data. So that alone is already a real contribution. So it was really a great pleasure for me to read this paper. It is a very, very rich paper. You have applied a whole battery of analyses, and I don't use my 10 or 15 minutes on a lot of technical issues, but more on maybe some more fundamental issues, which made then also trigger some sort of discussion afterwards. So your key question that you address with the paper is, do visa restrictions deter migrants from crossing borders, or do they rather shift the mode of entry from regular to irregular? What you find is, yes, there is a shift of migrants from regular to irregular status and entry modes. What I would sort of contest is that you have identified the deterrence effect. And why I'm saying that, the reason is because with this survey that UNHCR has implemented, obviously you don't capture the deterred non-migrants, right? So those who didn't migrate because of that policy change, that visa introduction, are not part of that. Are not part of this survey. So for that, actually, we would need to look at aggregate data to see, a sort of a policy effect on the overall and the total number of migrants, regular and irregular migrants, migrating into one of those neighboring countries or countries in the region. So I don't think that the paper is really addressing the deterrence question, but it is addressing the composition question. So what we may call deflection into irregularity, and that's that you find really robust results, which are very much in line with also in terms of the scale and the magnitude of the effect, what other papers also for the European context find. So I very much believe in and have faith in these outcomes, because they are really in line of what other papers using aggregate data also find. But let me maybe briefly dwell about this deflection effect and the size of this deflection effect. So basically what you find is that the share of irregular entries has increased. Yeah, so that's what we would expect based on theory, right? Based on quite some also conceptual work that has been done. So as a kind of a side effect or a negative externality of a restrictive policy, numbers of irregular migrants go up. I mean, Doug Massey has done the work on that, but also in the European context, we have seen that. But obviously, if a share or proportion goes up, it can either be because the nominator goes up or the denominator goes down, or both, right? So so if basically the share of irregular migrants increases, it can be because regular entrants are deflected into regularity. That's your argument, or just because there are less migrants in total, though less, also including less regular migrants, right? So indeed there are migrants or potential migrants that haven't decided to migrate, but stay put in their home country. In this case, in Venezuela. So we may ask, why should this be the case? Why is there non-migration or immobility as a consequence of this policy intervention? One of the arguments that has been addressed in the literature, and which we also have with a colleague of mine, we have worked on this question, is, it may be that it's not necessarily the observable factors, because you also test for that, whether there's a kind of a match at the micro level. So are there significant changes in the composition of that group, right? And you argue and you prove that no, that's not necessarily the case. So in terms of the age composition, the educational sort of attainment, etc., also gender composition. I mean, obviously within smaller margins there is some variation, but by and large the group as such, based on these observables, hasn't changed. But what about the risk attitudes and the differences we find there? So some of the unobservable factors might play a role in explaining changing composition in the population of migrants. So basically, after a policy restriction being implemented, we would assume that those who are more risk accepting or friendly still migrate, and the others are sort of deterred and stay back home. And that's what we find in a paper where we use longitudinal data on Indonesian migrants, where we try to estimate what is the sort of the size and the magnitude of the unobservable factors in migration decisions and in migration aspirations also. And we find that about 30% of differences in aspirations to migrate between migrants and non-migrants, so future migrants and non-migrants, has to be attributed to unobservable factors. So not age, not gender, not education or income or anything else that we can observe, but to unobservable factors. Sort of, well, we would sort of attribute this residual to cognitive factors or attitudinal factors or risk behavior. So that might explain, why people actually don't migrate as a response to this policy restriction, and not just shift their mode, but sort of cancel their migration move in total. Just to keep that in mind, I think it's a relevant aspect that we should, or also this research may consider in order to also make the argument clearer. I have now no doubts at all that there is deflection going on, so that the share and the proportion, that's what you're showing, is increasing. But is this due to an increase in the nominator, or rather to a decrease in the denominator? And if you could briefly share my slide that I've sent before, I would. Yes, thank you very much. Just as an example here, maybe to illustrate that point, let's take an example here of 100. So before the policy intervention, 100 irregular migrants and 100 regular migrants. So in total, 200 migrants into a country, 50% irregular migration rate. So once the visa restriction has been implemented, we may see an increase in irregular migrants, so from 100 to 120, but a decline in the number of regular migrants from 100 to 30 regular migrants. So in total, we may see a decline in the number of total migrants in a particular time period, obviously from 200, so before the intervention, to 150 after the intervention. So an increase, obviously, in the share or proportion of irregular migrants, right? So there's a deflection into irregularity, but also, in addition, a deterrence going on here. So now, if we think this a bit further, we now, from a more policy perspective, that's actually what policymakers may want to see, though, because that's often framed as a kind of an undesired or unwanted or unintended consequence of policy restrictions. But let's assume policymakers, and that's what actually happened also in Latin America, that a policy restriction or entry restrictions are combined with regularization program, right? And let's assume these 20 additional irregular migrants, as a consequence of visa restrictions, are actually regularized. So they get a regular status, so that in the end we still have 150 migrants, but we have brought sort of the irregular migration rate or stay rate down to 50%. Or this, not we, but this hypothetical government here. So in the end, right, we may see that the visa restriction in combination with the regularization, and we may even frame this as the loud visa restriction, the noisy visa restriction that shall deter migrants. That's the idea, really, to keep them in their place, as Oliver Baker writes. But in combination with a silent regularization program, right, that it shall not sort of create a pull effect. Regularization may also, create a kind of pull effect, bringing people in. So that's why this is relatively kept silent. Also, at the discourse level, it may end up that governments sort of find themselves in a Pareto superior situation, and not really, having this kind of negative effect or unintended consequence of more irregular migrants. Let me move to the next question. Thank you for the slides. You can close that now. Let me move to another point I would like to make, or maybe two other points. One is, and that's more framed as questions. What do you think? How do you sort of, to what extent are your results also affected by other behavioral options and responses that we see usually happening in taking place in the context of restrictive policy changes? For instance, spatial deflection. So I think in your figure 2 in the paper, you show quite nicely that there are shifts, geographical and spatial shifts of migrants to other destinations, towards Colombia initially after the announcement of the visa implementation, but also to other contexts. To what extent does this possibly affect also your results? What we also see in one of your graphs is the very nice temporal substitution effect, as we call it. That in anticipation of a policy change, we see a spike in numbers. That's not a unique effect here in this context. We see it in many other contexts as well. So this kind of beat the band type of migration, right? And to what extent may this have also affected your results? Because this is, ex ante of the policy change, we see already numbers increasing, just, as a consequence of the announcement of a policy change or the anticipation of that policy change. So, and that obviously it's quite relevant also for policymakers, because that, additional migration ahead of a policy change, and it's quite a steep spike here that we see here in, for instance, for Ecuador, right? That number might actually be larger than, if we would not see a policy change, and it would sort of be a flat line, maybe even increasing line, but not really, in terms of the overall number. So through the policy change, an additional number of potential migrants may be triggered to migrate who would have not migrated without a policy change. So that's actually something, or would have migrated later on, sort of, as a kind of a long-term project. So that's something I think may also play a role in your research, so sort of the temporal dimension here, and to what extent it may have affected, so kind of what's often called a now or never type of migration, this spike just ahead of the policy intervention, because one of the key assumptions in your difference in difference approach is obviously the parallel trends, right, and pre-intervention. The last behavioral option, which we also have studied, in other contexts, is the effect on return migration, and as a consequence of a entry visa restriction, or a restriction on entry, we see in other contexts that migrants are sort of pushed into longer stays, longer than planned stays. So a kind of the return intention is affected also by an entry policy change. And in the end, that might lead also to an increase in irregular stays in the total number of migrants. So not so much additional inflow, but rather longer stays of those who are already there, as a consequence of the policy change, because obviously return is procrastinated, is maybe even cancelled, or at least sort of some circular movements that are usually taking place in those contexts, in particular in free mobility or relatively barrier-free types of mobility context is sort of hampered through this intervention. A few minor points I would like to mention here as well: the role of confounding factors. So what about other policies that are sort of interfering here with this assumption that it is only the visa intervention that has taken place within this 10-month period that you're actually observing? So what about other policy interventions? You have mentioned a few in the paper, but what about economic cycles? How do you control for that? Some sort of changes there, changing public sentiments. I mean, that has changed. As far as I know, I'm not an expert on the region, by the way, right? So please correct me if I don't represent this here correctly. But it may have played a role in sort of also affecting your key assumption, which is sort of relatively parallel trends here in your difference in difference analysis. Then the control group composition. Why not Mexico taking in, and for instance also the US, but rather sticking to those I think 4 countries that you've decided for. And what about seasonal trends? We know that many, if not most, of migrants who move to Colombia and other places move by foot, having crossed mountainous regions and areas, and which is obviously much harder, and if not impossible, during the winter season, possibly. And do we see this? Is this a factor that may have affected also and played into sort of the size of the effects? And last but not least is obviously the representativeness of the survey data. This is, and you mentioned that, obviously not representative of the population of Venezuelan migrants, but it's those who have voluntarily approached UNHCR, and UNHCR has surveyed them. The question is, what drives this self-selection, right, of those who approach UNHCR? Why did they approach UNHCR? What is sort of the driving factor there at the micro level, and to what extent is this sort of affecting your results? I think that's something maybe where some follow-up research might be helpful to learn more about. These two groups of those who have approached UNHCR and those who haven't. There's research out there. We have done a study on trust in humanitarian organizations and international organizations, and obviously that's an important factor to what extent are international organizations approached by migrants, vulnerable migrants in particular, and what makes them, sort of trustworthy in the eyes of the migrants and whatnot. UNHCR obviously might count as a trustworthy organization, but still there's a self-selection going on. And last, the very last point, changing priorities. That's a really interesting finding. I haven't seen much research on that. That's really, I find really a very good point that, the shift from, migrants' activities and priorities once in the country, shifting from seeking employment to seeking papers. I was just wondering, is this just kind of a correlate of the fact that there are actually more irregular migrants post-intervention, and irregular migrants obviously have to care first about their status, and maybe after, even though it might also go in parallel. That's another point. Do we think it's a real trade-off here on the side of the migrant, or can't they do both, right? Applying for irregular status and seek employment. So is it really a restriction on the migrants' behavioral sort of space, or is there something else going on, like just simply more irregular migrants who by the fact of their status have to or quite naturally are inclined to sort of regularize their stay, and therefore prioritize also the search for on the applications for legal documents. So please apologize if I have taken too much of your time, but I hope you can sort of reflect on those points, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Matthias. This is what you get when you get one of the top scholars in the world on the subject. You get the union of almost all possible referee reports condensed into 15 minutes, and it's been very rich and helpful. Omar, we have time if you wanted to take a few minutes to just offer some thoughts. No need, but sure, if you feel like it.
Sure, absolutely. No, I mean, it's very rich. Thank you so much for all this feedback. Unfortunately, clearly I can't address it all. But there is definitely something that this is definitely something that I will take into consideration. Unfortunately, the issue of representativeness. There's two main questions for me. The issue of representativeness. This is a tricky one because, of course, because so much of these populations of Venezuelans in all of these countries is irregular. How do we know what representative is, right? Given that we know what is representative of those who are regularized and have actually some sort of migratory status, but what about those? Is it the case that actually some of them are, is actually the same population? Let me just make an example. There is some research that the World Bank now is doing, where they show, for instance, that some Venezuelan migrants in Colombia, when the government asked them to register themselves, but not to regularize, it was just to register themselves before it allowed them to regularize. That registration with the government was not done by all Venezuelans equally. Actually, the more educated tried to regularize, and the less educated, unfortunately, did not participate into this registry, right? So this registry had nothing to do at the time with becoming legal in the country. It was just a way to let the government know that they were there. And for instance, you see that there might be in some cases a bit of a difference. Although this is specifically for the case of Colombia, right? Because of course the point of this paper is that there is no difference. It's just depending on when you were on your way to the host country, how that affected your decision to migrate either regularly, and if you couldn't, then otherwise. In terms of the unobservables, this is a bit tricky, but I would definitely welcome any ideas, because actually I hear a bit of an advertisement from my side. Based on all of these discussions that I've had with the UNHCR on this, with the Peru office, we're actually going to start a new initiative trying to do more research and collect more data in order to, as a follow-up to this project. Once we get the funding, we're still looking for funding options to fund this. but definitely this is very useful. Thank you so much. I'll probably stop here. And Michael, if you have any questions, I'm happy, or comments, I'm happy to take on those.
Yes, thank you. So one that came to my mind is a particular form of the parallel trends assumption that might be violated, and I know you know this, but I'll just state it for this forum: the stable unit treatment value assumption, or SUTVA, which just means that we need the treatment of the treatment group not to affect the control group. The potential outcome for the control group can't be altered by the fact that the treatment group was treated. And I found myself wondering, if Chile introduces visa restrictions but Argentina doesn't, and we have therefore people going to Argentina who otherwise would have gone to Chile, that's a very clear violation of SUTVA, and it's one that it seems to me that you could address in many ways. Just hypothetically, you could address it with qualitative information. You could address it with the knowledge that in the survey, for example, suppose that most of the people choosing Chile or Argentina are doing it because of previous travel experience there or family ties there. Then our model for their destination choice should not be one of just shifting around, going to whatever country doesn't have visa restrictions. So I don't think it's a serious objection, but I'm sure it's one that you're likely to encounter, and maybe you already address it.
Yep. This is a very good point. No, thank you so much, Michael. This is definitely that I might try and answer with some further interviews and discussing with UNHCR individuals. But I think, from what is my experience in the field. So I, for instance, just to give you an idea, I first got I thought that this research was possible when I was visiting a migrant center in Lima, where actually run by a Jesuit NGO, and it was really a stunning place, because you would have people really coming all their way from the border, walking with their kids on their shoulders, and would get into these places to get some sort of a support and advice, and they would register. And this again is my personal experience. In none of these cases, it seemed to me that the paperwork, so to speak, was a big rationale for choosing one country against another. It was just feel like, okay, this is a hurdle that I have to overcome. So if my objective is Chile, I will just go to Chile no matter what. And for instance, I was talking with some UNHCR officials, and they told me, for instance, that in the last days, especially of the Piñera government, so the former government, the controls at the border were even made more difficult because they were trying to stop as many Venezuelans as possible. And what happened was that many Venezuelans were crossing straight through the desert in order to get further down into and enter into Chile. So what is suggested to me is not so much, what I believe is the case, but then again, I probably need more evidence to suggest this, is that the more restrictions the countries have put into the way of migrants, the more dangerous the journeys that they have taken, without necessarily changing their preference of destination country, because their preference might be, in most cases, dictated by the networks that they have in those countries, right? So if I have a cousin, a friend of a friend who lives there, then I will still prefer Chile over to Argentina, let's say, because that's and many cases, being regularly or not, they don't really think of it as necessarily to be regularly there, because in most instances they are they work in the informal sector, even if they're regularly there, right? So they don't really see, at least at the beginning, as a big advantage of being regular. But then again, of course, they realize later on how important that is. I hope that answers the question, but of course, it's something that I will address.
Very much. Mathias, if you wanted to come in, please do. But I had a comment on policy. Last year something really extraordinary happened in the U.S. government, which is that shortly after President Biden was elected, he issued an executive order regarding Central America, and specifically efforts to deter irregular migration from Central America. And in there were the things you might expect: reforms to the asylum system, additional assistance to the region to address the quote-unquote root causes of migration. But there was also something else, which is that he ordered the US government to extend more visas to Central America, explicitly for the purpose of shifting people who otherwise would migrate irregularly into regular channels. I don't know of another time that a US president has done that. I don't know of very many national leaders who have ever done something like that. And it's been controversial. It's controversial to this day. I was on a New York Times podcast with an expert on migration, who asserted to me that not only do potential irregular migrants from Central America to the US make their decisions independently of regular channels, many of them actually prefer to migrate irregularly, in that the lawful alternatives often tie you to a single employer, and people who work on the black market don't have that restriction, and et cetera, et cetera. I've seen, this is an area where I think, this is one of many areas where I think qualitative research has a lot to offer. And I've seen two specific studies from Mexico, one from Tamaulipas state and one from Michoacan state, where two different, I believe one's an anthropologist and one's a geographer, literally interviewed a bunch of people who have done both, migrated to the US irregularly and migrated to the US on visas, and asked them to compare and contrast the experiences. And just to give you a flavor of the results, of the one from Tamaulipas was unanimous. Everybody said that migrating on a visa was far better: safety, pay, dignity, and many other things. The title of the study from Michoacan is Mil veces contratado que mojado, which basically means it's 1,000 times better to go as a temporary guest worker than to go as an irregular migrant. And I really wonder if you think there are broader lessons for policymakers around the world, or would you only address this policy to the Ecuadorian government?
Sorry. No, definitely. I mean, this is great that the qualitative research, it complements all the sometimes dry quantitative findings. But anyway, I do think this is a situation in which if we can get more regular migration, if we can push people to regularize, to do their trips regularly, or if they're irregular, then to push countries to actually give an amnesty to everyone, like Colombia or Ecuador now are doing. I think that will make everyone better off. I don't see any downsizes to any of that. No, definitely not.
Thank you, Omar. And we have just a couple of minutes. I saw an audience question come in from Daniel Di Martino, who, if I am correct, is at Columbia University. I'll just read it. Mexico recently implemented restrictions on Venezuelans, asking them for visas, pressured by the Biden administration to reduce border crossings. And that's why we see so many Venezuelans crossing the Darien Gap, which connects South America to Mesoamerica. Do you observe the mode of transportation for the migrants that you surveyed, or the migrants surveyed? I'm thinking that the visa restrictions would increase land migration, that is irregular, versus trips by airplanes. That's the question.
Yes, no, definitely. I mean, the survey questions do include the mode of transport. So definitely that's taken into account. But as anyone who's familiar with the South American context, of course, because many people in Venezuela don't even have a passport to start with, they can't get on a flight period. So that's not even an option for many of them. And of course, if you want to go north, so toward Mexico, the US, Canada, or Europe, then you need to have a passport, and usually that means usually that's applicable to people who are wealthier or more educated, or have another citizenship, or have friends who can support them in the process, or know some officials. But that's unfortunately not an option. And of course, the more difficult it becomes to be able to get to the US, the more dramatic the situation in South America, the more we will continue seeing stories such as the one now unfolding in Panama. So the border between Colombia and Panama, the Darien Gap. It's a very dangerous route that increasingly more migrants are taking, and unfortunately, you are likely to see these stories even more and more on the news in the following months.
I saw another one come in from my colleague Thomas Ginn, who is one of the world's leading upcoming economists studying forced migration in many different contexts. Thomas writes, how should we think about weighting and clustering? The treatment and total migration, parentheses, the most important dependent variable in my view, close parentheses, is at the country level. The treatment and total migration is at the country level, but the data is individual level. Are you making the right standard errors? He's asking.
Oh, about the standard errors.
Are you clustering your standard errors?
Yeah, I mean, I can change the clustering, of course. I just did it at the moment. I've just done it at the country level. If there are some suggestions about how that could be changed, or even to address some specific issues, I could do that. But of course, here what I'm interested in is the aggregate level, right? So does this change looking at the overall percentages, considering the fact that when we compare the pre and post treatment period, their main characteristics do not change substantially. But if you have any suggestions, happy to take those into account.
I'm sorry, this format doesn't allow Thomas to interact directly, but my reading of the comment is that he's recommending you're clustering at the country level, and in fact you are clustering at the country level.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So Thomas, forgive me if I got that wrong, but that's my interpretation of the recommendation, and it's a good one, and you're doing it. We need to end. We're at time. Thank you both so much, Omar. This is incredibly useful research. You ended your presentation with the rhetorical question: is it policy relevant? To me, that's a question that answers itself. And from Mathias, expectedly, we got a master course from you in this very important field, and I couldn't be more grateful, and hope to see you again soon. And every video meeting like this is anticlimactic in that the people just sort of close the window. But let me try to compensate for that by just applauding both of you and thanking you again. And see you soon.
No, thank you very much for having us and for the invitation. Yeah.
Thank you very much, both of you. It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye. Be well.